Have you ever wondered how a single decision made in one country can send waves across the entire world? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dive into a major economic forecast for 2025 that does exactly that. We're going to trace how one single action is creating ripples all across the global economy.
So here's how we'll break it down. We're going to start with the catalyst, the single policy that's making all the waves. Then we'll follow that first ripple as it causes a global slowdown. After that, we'll see how it creates totally different stories for the US, Europe, and China. And finally, we'll line up the numbers and look at the big risks that could change everything.
Okay, so to really understand this entire forecast, it all boils down to one central question. What is the single biggest headwind that's expected to drag the global economy down in 2025?
And the answer, according to this report, is surprisingly simple: higher US tariffs. That's it. Almost every other major prediction that we're about to talk about stems from this one policy decision. And that brings us to the core idea of this entire forecast, the tariff ripple effect. So let's follow the waves from this one policy, starting with that first really big ripple that's going to hit just about everyone. The first and most immediate consequence of these tariffs is a pretty broad slowdown across the entire global economy. This is the top-line worldwide impact. The report is forecasting global economic growth to slow down to just 2.5%. And the analysts draw a direct line from this slowdown, right back to those tariffs we just talked about. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Even though growth is slowing down, global inflation is forecast to hold steady at 2.7%. Now, wait a minute. Slower growth usually means lower inflation. So how can both of these things be happening at the same time? Well, that contradiction is the key to this whole thing.
So this leads to the obvious next question, right? If the global number looks steady, does that mean the impact is pretty much the same for everyone? Well, the report's answer to that is a big no.
Not even close. In fact, underneath that calm-looking global average, these tariff ripples are creating wildly different outcomes for the world's big economic players: the US, the Euro area, and China. And here it is, the Great Divide. In the US, the report argues that higher tariffs will actually boost inflation, making everything more expensive. But over in the Euro area, those exact same tariffs are expected to do the opposite. They're creating disinflationary pressure that actually pushes prices down. So let's zoom in on the US. The picture here is kind of like stagflation light. You've got growth slowing to just 1.1%, while inflation heats up to 3.2%, and unemployment starts to climb. The report traces this right back to the tariffs, which basically act like a tax, hitting both what people can spend and what businesses are willing to invest. Now let's jump across the Atlantic, where the story completely flips. The Euro area sees some modest growth, but its inflation is forecast to fall right to that 2.0% sweet spot. So why the difference? Well, the report points to a fascinating side effect. Goods that can't be sold to the US because of tariffs create an excess supply elsewhere, which helps push prices down. And then you've got China, which is just in a totally different universe. The report sees really strong growth at 4.7%, but, and get this, an inflation number of 0. Yep, 0. The analysis points to a massive overcapacity problem. Basically, they're making way more stuff than people are buying, which is why policymakers are kind of holding back on more stimulus. Okay. So those are the three very different stories. Now let's just put the key numbers next to each other so you can really see how stark these differences are. This table just makes it crystal clear. Look at the relationship between growth and inflation. The US has okay growth but high inflation. The Euro area has lower growth and lower inflation. And then China just breaks the whole model with the highest growth and 0 inflation. It's pretty wild. But if you remember just one number from this entire forecast, make it this one: 3.2%. That's where this report sees U.S. core inflation ending the year. Now for the Federal Reserve, which is targeting 2%, a number this high, boosted by tariffs, would make cutting interest rates really, really difficult. Of course, a forecast is just a path. It's not a destination. And this report is very clear that there are several huge uncertainties out there that could easily knock this whole economic picture off course. So, what should we be watching? Well, no surprise here, the biggest wildcards are all about policy and geopolitics. Any major change in U.S. tariff policy could rewrite the whole script.
And that's before you even factor in huge external shocks, like conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine, or the fragile state of US-China relations. And that brings us to the final, critical question. We've seen the path that the economic models are predicting. But in a world that's really driven by unpredictable politics and conflicts, which one of these wildcards will be the one to actually redraw the map? That's the question that's going to define 2025.